My name is Estefania, and you're watching the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Vincent Lane, former chairman of the Chicago Housing Authority, as well as a 1973 graduate of the University of Chicago Business School, has worked in and around affordable housing development both locally and nationally for over 4 decades.
We spoke with Vince about his experiences growing up on the south side of Chicago, his time as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and some of the innovative and controversial policies he implemented during his tenure at the CHA.
From the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
I'm Steve Crano.
I'm Kyra Sturgill.
Don't go away.
Hey UC3P listeners, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
Vince Lane, former director of the Chicago Housing Authority, thank you so much for joining us on Chicagoland today. How are you, sir?
I'm very fine, thank you.
And we're sitting here in a building at 1307 East 60th Street on the University of Chicago campus. This is the Keller Center. And before it was the Keller Center, it was actually a graduate dormitory that you lived in as a graduate student at the business school, correct?
Correct. I got my master's in business administration in 1973.
So a lot of history in this campus and this building in particular. We want to get started by just getting a little personal background of you. Can you tell us about growing up, where you were born, what neighborhood you lived in?
I was born in West Point, Mississippi. My parents moved to Chicago when I was 3 months old. And my mom was a teacher in West Point, and she was an entrepreneur here in Chicago. My parents bought 3 apartment buildings, and the family, the 13 siblings of my mom's, operated a barbecue restaurant for a while, and she operated a neighborhood tavern for about 12 years. So I guess that's where I got my entrepreneurial leanings. My dad only had a 4th grade education, but he had work ethic, and that's what he taught me. And so he worked at the same place for over 37 years. I grew up, the first place I grew up was in the 11th Ward, and the 11th Ward is Bridgeport, but it was the other side of the tracks of Bridgeport at 37th and Wentworth. And I had a paper route, sold newspapers at Comiskey Park, and I had to run every week to collect my money over in the real Bridgeport because it was not a friendly place for black kids in those days. I went to Abbott School, which is across the street from Wentworth Gardens. And I think that all of this stuff just recycles because I never thought that I would be doing anything with public housing. And even though I didn't grow up in public housing, I grew up across the street, and all of the kids at Robert S. Abbott, where I went to school, were from Wentworth Gardens. I graduated from Abbott with pretty good grades. I was enrolled at Tilden Tech. This was years ago when Tilden Tech was similar to Lane Tech on the north side. And it was pre-engineering and math. Graduated from there, went to the University of Illinois initially in electrical engineering. And then I got married at 19.
Wow.
Well, that threw a monkey wrench into my plans to be an engineer. So that's when I switched to Roosevelt University. I knew that I had to support a family, and I knew I could not go the last 2 years at the U of I in Champaign, because then it was only a 2-year school in Chicago. I went to school at Navy Pier, and that's another thing that is recycled in my life. So I transferred to Roosevelt, got a degree in accounting, and then went to work at big corporations, International Harvester, U.S. Steel, and then Mount Sinai Hospital. That was in 1968. That's where I met Ruth Rothstein, who ran Mount Sinai for decades and managed Cook County Hospital. So that's where I met Ruth, and that's recycled. Ruth was one of my very best and first board members on the CHA board. I was blessed. I was the first African-American controller of Mount Sinai Hospital, then probably at the age of 23 or 24. Changed jobs, and I changed jobs frequently. And this, I hope that some of your listeners will take heed. Don't get stuck in a job. Don't be afraid to venture out and challenge yourself to be successful.
I think you're an excellent model of that, having, gone down this path where you were going to become an engineer, and then you got diverted and decided, hey, I can be anything. And you became something of a bit of an engineer of social systems later on.
Absolutely.
That's a great way to put it.
After I left Mount Sinai, I went to work for an African-American publishing company called Tuesday Magazine. It was like the parade. It's an insert in the regular newspapers, and it was an insert in probably about 15 to 20 newspapers around the country. We built up the revenues and the success story, and then a friend of mine from the Co-op Bank in New York asked me if I would interview for a job in Woodlawn. That was in 1971.
You were a graduate student at that time?
I was working at Woodlawn. Tuesday, I spent my first year in grad school here at the university, and I spent my second year working in Woodlawn in grad school and graduated in 1973.
I see.
So that gave me an opportunity to get involved in politics and in community development. I had no knowledge of either one, but I knew that I could do it, and I wasn't afraid to try it. So Bishop Arthur M. Brazier, who was the chairman of the Woodlawn Organization and the Woodlawn Community Development Corporation, he reached out and interviewed me along with Leon Finney, and we all hit it off. They thought I could handle the job, and it went fine. The first 4 years, we built literally hundreds of units, including Jackson Park Terrace, which is not far from you up the street, and rehab housing and senior housing. And so it was a great success.
What was the experience like working in Woodlawn while also being a graduate student at the business school at the University of Chicago? Because I think today there kind of exists a bit of a divide between Hyde Park and Woodlawn. A lot of students choose to live in Hyde Park versus Woodlawn, even though a lot of the U of C campus is technically in Woodlawn. So I'm just wondering what it was like, whether there was that kind of divide and whether or not it kind of felt like you were occupying two different kinds of communities in that time.
That's exactly right. But also, there was a kind of détente between Woodlawn and the university. University, of course, is not going anywhere. And the Woodlawn community, essentially, Dr. Brazier and Leon Finney said, university, You stay on your side of the street, 61st Street, and we'll stay on our side. And that went on really for years. But there was a change that occurred when Dr. Brazier and Leon Finney approached the mayor and said, Mayor, we would like, because we've done a lot of development already, developed almost everything from 63rd Street to the Midway on Stony Island. He said, we'd like to do, and it was mostly low-income and affordable housing. We'd like to do some market-rate housing, but we don't think we can get it done while the L track is standing.
Which mayor was this, and which L track?
This was Mayor Daley
Original.
father, original.
Yeah. Senior.
But it really got pushed forward under Rich Daley.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And this was the fact that the Green Line used to run down 63rd to
Stony Island.
Right.
Mm.
And now it stops at Cottage Grove.
Mm-hmm.
And so it happened. Dr. Brazier and Dr. Finney convinced the community that it was worth the sacrifice to create a new look and bring some market-rate families into Woodlawn. And as a result of that, this tension eased a bit between the university and Woodlawn. We actually formed a partnership with the university and LISC, that's a national not-for-profit that's worked in Woodlawn, and we created a plan to redevelop from Woodlawn, the block after the new single-family homes that were built that you see on both sides of 63rd Street between the Metro Line and Woodlawn. We developed a plan with Magellan as our project manager to build new rental and for-sale housing, both market rate and affordable. And the university, we had to work with them because the university, I think they did this before we finalized our plan to redevelop 63rd Street from Woodlawn to Drexel. But they created a program that gives $10,000 of equity for employees of the university if they lived in Woodlawn. So that was a little boost for our program to try to jumpstart this market rate development in the community. And so although we had tensions from day one when I started in 71, that period of time allowed us to work collaboratively with the university.
So if we could fast forward about a decade and a half, you were appointed chairman of the CHA in 1988, and this was a big transition into an executive role. Can you talk about how your work at the Woodlawn Community Development Corporation helped prepare you to lead the third largest public housing agency in the country?
Well, I wasn't looking to lead CHA. But
how did that appointment come about?
It was an interesting how it occurred. I was on a not-for-profit board, Metropolitan Planning Council, and they appointed me to chair the Public Housing Committee of MPC. And that's where I got my feet wet. Of course, I knew low-income housing and development and property management, so I had that background. And that's why I think MPC said, well, why don't we have a look at you chair public housing, the Public Housing Committee? I said, okay. I did it. I got familiar with the residents, with the condition of the properties, all the properties. And we had some difficulty with the management structure of CHA. We had a chairman of the board, and we had an executive director. And that went on for years and years. I'm not going to castigate any one of the other, but there was always friction And seemingly the board was always at odds with the operating